Doug, as we're concluding this life story, and again, let me thank you for doing this. I'm remiss in not having given credit to the one person who was responsible for the whole thing. And Mary Jane directed me. Various people have been close personal friends. But the hand of God had to have been in my hand from time to time with respect to near-death occurrences that I had, but also with respect to my devotion to God and what the Lord has meant to me throughout my life and the part that it has played. As I told you in the previous review, when my mother was run over by this Model T car, and I pledged my life to the Lord by virtue of saying that I would become a priest, I had served Mass. I was born and raised Catholic, and I had served Mass from the time I was 4 years old until the time I was about 16 or 17. And serving Mass means that you're on the altar with the priest during the Mass, and you perform various functions for them. As an example, opening the epistle to this particular portion that involved in that area of the Mass. You ring the bell when the priest is blessing himself, and it's Gloria, Gloria, Gloria as you ring the bell for each one and so forth. And of course the rosary is very important in the life of Catholics. That's a 50 prayer Hail Mary and a half a dozen Our Fathers and an Apostle Creed. But it's each time you pray, each prayer in the rosary, you're remembering the Lord and God and asking Him for forgiveness, asking Him for His help and so forth. I have been remiss oftentimes in my religious life, and I've had kind of a history of different religions, and this is kind of interesting because I was born and raised a Catholic, and I was a Catholic until after the war. And Mary Jane became a Catholic, and after the war, and I was in law school, we lived on Doton Avenue in Grandview, Ohio, a suburb of Columbus, and we couldn't find a church. I was trying to go to the Catholic church, but our oldest daughter couldn't find any friends there, and they had no youth programs. Mary Jane couldn't really fit in at the Catholic church, and there was a church being started in Grandview called the Community Church. And my wife started going there, and actually I think our kids introduced us to that church because their friends had started going there, and they had a great youth program for the community. And I think most of the parents that went to that church went because of the youth programs that were involved, and they were good. And our kids became members there and became involved and so forth. And Mary Jane became very active there. She was treasurer of the Women's Guild, and generally was very active. I had never joined that church. They had a fellow by the name of Burkhart who I never quite trusted. I always thought that he was in it not so much for the Lord's work, but for his own aggrandizement. And my concerns were ultimately culminated when he was caught, I guess, in the bedroom with one of the wives of one of the members and so forth, and became disgraced. And from that time on, they had a turmoil in that church with different pastors coming in. But Burkhart was literally rode out of the church on a rail because of his conduct with some of the ladies in the church. We were at the Muirfield Golf Tournament in Columbus, Ohio. That's a tournament, as you know, that Jack Nicklaus had started there. And we were sitting at one of the holes. I forget what hole it was, but some friends of ours came by and we started talking about, for one reason or other, about churches. And they said, you ought to visit our church. They were Lutherans. You ought to visit our church because we have a new assistant pastor who was formerly a submarine commander in the Navy, graduated from the Naval Academy, left the Navy after 17 years, only had 3 more years to go to retirement, left the Navy, came to Columbus and went to the Capital University and studied to be a Lutheran minister, graduated, and is now one of the assistant ministers of our church. If you want to come next Sunday, give us a ring and we'll come by and pick you up, and we want you to hear him. I think you'd be impressed." So they pick us up. We went to the Lutheran church, and we were impressed. And after the service, after his sermon and so forth, we got to talk to him in the foyer as we were leaving. And he told me that he was on patrol with his nuclear submarine, and he was completing the logbook for the day's activities, and he saw a vision on his wall, and it was Jesus. And Christ said to him, "Why are you in the business of destroying lives? You should be saving lives." And with that, the vision disappeared. Yeah, what? Boy, I'm overworked here or something. I can't, what's happening here, see? And he said, I kind of ultimately put it out of my mind. But he said, I was restless all that night. I couldn't sleep. He said, the next night it happened again. This vision appeared to me. He said, I immediately sent a message to Rickover, who was head of the nuclear submarine department of the Navy, that I was resigning upon our return to our patrol, and that they should be looking for another commanding officer of the Blue Squadron. The Navy has two crews on nuclear submarine, the Blue and the Gold. The Blue goes out for 60 days, while the Gold stays in and repairs. Then the Gold goes out for 60 days, and it's you have a 60-day patrol. Anyway, he said, we came in from patrol, and I immediately had a message from Rickover that says, come to Washington, D.C. immediately to my office. He said, I went in, and for 4 days, Rickover pounded on me to stay in the Navy. He said, you realize we've got $25 or $30 million tied up in your education. You cannot leave. We need nuclear submarine officers in the worst way. And he pounded on me for 4 days, and I just hung on to that vision of why were you. He said, I prevailed. And Rickover, with much reluctance and absolutely cursing me up one side and down the other in the worst manner that you could imagine, literally kicked me out of the Navy. He couldn't kick me out, but he dismissed me. And he said, you're nuts, you don't know what you're doing, you're following a false god, and so forth. He was Jewish. Rickover, of course, was Jewish. Anyway, he comes to Columbus. He finishes up at Capitol, comes out to this Lutheran church. And from then on, we started going to this Lutheran church. Ultimately, the senior minister retired, and we thought sure that this guy, who was just incredible, would be chosen as a senior minister, but he was a little on the young side for a parish that was that large, for a church that was that large. So they searched around, and they found a gentleman on the West Coast where they brought in a senior minister and left him as one of the 7 assistant ministers in that church, 6 or 7 or whatever it was. We started going to a Bible study class at the home of the senior minister. The ladies would each bring a dish of some kind, and we'd have dinner, and then we'd have Bible study. And in the meantime, we were spending the winters in Florida and coming back to Columbus in the spring and summer. And while we were in Florida, we had returned to Mary Jane's church of her youth, which was a Presbyterian church, because of Jim Kennedy, who ran Coral Ridge Presbyterian. And Coral Ridge Presbyterian was about 25 or 30 minutes from where we lived, and we'd drive down to his church, and we just loved him. I mean, we just thought the sun rose and set. And I was so impressed, and Mary Jane was so impressed, that we both joined the Presbyterian church at Coral Ridge in Florida. So we started going to the home of the senior minister in Columbus, the Lutheran church. And one day I said to him, you know, we're kind of interested in joining the Lutheran church. And he said, well, what are your members of now? I said, we're Presbyterians in Florida. And he said, oh, well, he said, you can leave the Presbyterian church and become Lutheran. I said, no, I don't want to leave the Presbyterian church. I want to be Presbyterian in the wintertime and Lutheran in the summer. He says, you can't do that. Where did you ever get an idea like that? I mean, he just came right up from it. Where did you ever get an idea like that? And I said, well, we like both of the churches, but we like them because of the pastor. We like you, we respect you, we think you're doing a tremendous job. We'd like to be part of your church as a member. Oh, he said, you can't do that, you can't do that. So we continued going to the Bible studies at his home twice a month or whatever. And about 3 meetings after this, he stops me at the door, shakes my hand as we're leaving, and he said, Jack, you know, he said, I've been thinking this thing over about you and Mary Jane being Presbyterians in the wintertime and Lutherans in the summer. He said, I have a great deal of respect and admiration for Jim Kennedy. if you're good enough for Jim Kennedy in the wintertime, you're good enough for us in the summertime. So he said, I'm making an exception, and to my knowledge, you're the only couple in the United States that are members of both the Lutheran Church and the Presbyterian Church. So then we became active in the Lutheran Church, and as you know, you came up at the church and the choir and so forth. But then we were Protestants. We stayed Protestant all the time we lived in Florida, and all the time we'd come back to Columbus, and then we sold our place in Columbus and no longer went to the Lutheran Church, but we always continued going to the Presbyterian Church in Coral Ridge. And Mary Jane was very active in Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church. She was very active in the seminary that Jim Kennedy started. She was a life member of the women's group for that, and she was really involved. And we'd go down there 2 or 3 times a week to Bible study and things of that nature. And we were devout. We were devout Presbyterians. Then we moved up here, and of course there was no Presbyterian minister, and Mary Jane was out of it. And it didn't really, although we met a black priest here, Father B., who was a native of Africa and had come to this country and become a priest. And the first time I saw him, we had just moved in here, and a fellow by the name of Bergholz, who was ultimately a friend of Allen and Cozy's because of us, was doing some work for me here. He got me that cabinet for my television and so forth, and finished it, and building shelves and things for me. And I was sitting on the porch over in one of the other buildings, having a drink after a round of golf with a friend of mine, and I see this black priest walking up the path right in front of where we were sitting. So I said, Father, are you new here? And he said, yes. He said, I've been assigned here as the priest for this thing. And I went over and introduced myself, and I said, well, I'm very happy to meet you. I said, there's a fellow working down in my house right now who's a very close friend of mine. I said, he's got his PhD, and he's just doing this stuff for me as a favor. But I said, go down and introduce yourself and tell him I sent you down to save him. So, save him? I said, yeah, just walk in and say, your name Bergholz? He said, I just stopped in to save you and see what happened. So he comes down here and introduces himself, and they became fast, close friends. I mean, they just became the best of friends. And Cozy then got in the act, and Cozy just loved Father B. As a matter of fact, when Father B was going back to Africa for a 3-week or 4-week period of time, and incidentally, his father was a tribal leader in Nigeria of one of the 8 tribes that are involved in that country, and they're a well-respected family there. And Mary Jane led a movement to collect a ton of clothes, and we had huge bags of clothes in here that we sent. He checked in the airplane to go back to Nigeria to give to the poor people. We had T-shirts and everything we could think of, a ton of stuff that he sent back. And when he came back from Nigeria, he brought Cozy a traditional Nigerian garb with the dress and the headset and the whole business. And one time we were having a party over there, and Cozy wore it. Everybody just went crazy. It was the greatest thing they had ever seen. So Father B and us, we all became very good friends. And Father B, we had a very unusual funeral, you may remember, for Mary Jane, because Mike Milton, who was the senior Presbyterian minister at First Presbyterian here, gave the ceremony, and Father B gave a eulogy, and it was the only funeral that most anybody had ever attended that was conducted by both a priest and a minister, and they both got along real well because they both just loved Mary Jane, and rightfully so. So we had a Monsignor Seaver that was retired and was quasi-invalid. He was in a wheelchair, living over on the 6th floor. And Mary Jane was living on the 6th floor, and periodically when I'd go to see her, I went over to see Mary Jane twice a day, but on maybe every 3rd or 4th day, I'd stop in and say hello to Monsignor Seaver. And I found out that he liked Mexican beer, and so on Sundays, Sunday afternoon when I'd go to see Mary Jane, before I'd go in her room, I'd stop into his room with 2 bottles of Mexican beer and some pretzels, and he and I would sit there and drink this beer and eat the pretzels and discuss religion and philosophy and things of that nature. He was a highly educated gentleman, a wonderful guy. And one of the things we talked about, of course, was philosophy and religion, and I reiterated the experience, my religious experience with him, similar to what I've just done here with you. And he said, did you ever think about coming back to the church? And I said, no, I haven't really thought about that. Well, he said, I think you ought to. I think you ought to give it some consideration, because he said, I'd like to bring you back. And he said, you were born and raised Catholic, and you've been Lutheran, you've been Presbyterian. And he said, I think it's time for you to return to the Mother Church. And I said, well, Father, if I did, I'd have to go to confession. And I said, I haven't been to confession for 50 years, and if I told you everything I did for 50 years, you'd faint out of that chair of yours. And you'd give me the penance they give is that saying a number of prayers, like say half a dozen, 6 Hail Marys, 2 Our Fathers, and an Apostle Creed. That's your penance, and supposedly your sins are forgiven that you've confessed to. And he said, no, he said, Jack, I won't do that. He said, you can just generalize with me. And he said, I'll take it easy on you. He said, it's not going to be any big deal. I said, Father, it's going to be a big deal, because 50 years and coming back to the Catholic Church after being a Protestant all this time is going to be tough. Well, he said, I wish you'd do it. He said, I feel very strongly about it. I'm getting vibes about this. And he said, I'd like to have you kneel down here by my wheelchair. He said, I'm going to put my hand on your head, and you tell me, make your confession. So I thought for a minute, and I thought, yes, this is what I should do. I mean, I should come back to my church. My father was buried a Catholic. My mother was buried a Catholic. Mary Jane had been a Catholic. I was not particularly taken with Protestantism insofar as the depth was concerned. I mean, it was rather shallow compared. I liked the formality. I liked the Mass of the Catholic Church. I liked the mystique of the Catholic Church. So anyway, I kneeled down beside him. He put his hand on my head. I said, bless me, Father, for I have sinned. My last confession was made 50 years ago. Since then, I've committed the following sins. And I said, I don't remember how many times, but I did this. I swore. I don't know how many times, but I did this, blah, blah, blah. And he said, bless you. He said, your penance will be 5 Our Fathers, 15 Hail Marys, and you can say them right here now. And then I'll give you communion. So I did my penance, and I went back into the Catholic Church. But during my Protestant career, I've had some incredible experience, one of which was with the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. It was probably, the Fellowship of Christian Athletes was barely a year old, and I got involved with Tom Landry and Branch Rickey and some of the founders of the FCA, and I got involved with them by virtue of United States Senator John Bricker, who had heard about the movement and had met Branch Rickey. Senator Bricker was a good friend of John Galbraith. John Galbraith owned the Pittsburgh Pirates. The Pittsburgh Pirates were involved with the team that Branch Rickey owned, the New York Yankees, and the connection there. And Bricker called me one day and said, I'd like to have lunch with you. And he said, you've just finished your term as president of the Touchdown Club. You're familiar with athletics and so forth, and I'd like to tell you about an organization. And Rex Kern was quarterback at the time. Archie Griffin was coming out of high school. And he said, we've got some great athletes here that I'd like to get involved with this movement, the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. And he explained it to me, and he said, I wish you'd talk to Tom Landry. He said, we'll go over to my office and call him and let him tell you what it's all about. So we did, and I talked to Tom Landry, and I said, yes, this is something I'd really like to be involved with. So I said, let me start the organization. He said, we don't have anybody in Ohio representing you. I said, let me do it. Give me the FCA in Ohio. I said, well, I'll see what I can do. Well, I knew that I had a lot of contacts through my work. We had clients in most every town in Ohio, which would give me an opportunity to talk to these guys and get things going. I knew it wasn't going to be any trouble getting the fire in their belly of those guys, because most of the guys that I liked best that were clients were pretty devout, religious, and were kind of patriotic. They were kind of my kind of guy. So anyway, I got the FCA going in Ohio. And I was the first president of the state organization. I was first president of the Columbus organization. Archie Griffin was a senior in high school, and I took him to his first FCA meeting. up in Westerville, and he was shaking in his boots. I picked him up at his home, and we're heading for Westerville. He said, "I've never." He said, "Am I supposed to make a speech?" And I said, "No, you're not supposed to make a speech. You just kind of tell these kids about your career and what God and Christ have meant to you in your life." I said, "You're a student of the Bible. You say your prayers at home, and what part, if any," and I said, "I know there's been a pretty important part for you as far as religion is concerned. What part it has played in your school life as a senior in football and things like that." At that time, the Naval Academy was very adamant. They wanted to get Archie Griffin there as bad as they could, and I was a bird dog for the Naval Academy, and I was trying to recruit him to go to the Naval Academy. See, well, Woody and the rest of those guys are just busting their butt trying to get him to Ohio State, and we were kind of coming in conflict. I got Archie on the Navy. Annapolis sent a private plane out to Columbus to get Archie. They hauled him back to Annapolis he had lunch in the Great Hall there. He walked into the Great Hall, and all of the cadets stopped and hip hip hooray, gave him a big cheer, and he came out back to Columbus. His eyes were that big. He said, "Boy, this is a great place." Well, Woody is yanking him the other way, and Woody's talking about his patriotism and his loyalty to the state of Ohio and so forth, and the fact that if he came to Ohio State, he could play professional football and do all those things. If you go to the Naval Academy, you got to put in 5 years, and you won't. Well, anyway, as you know, Woody prevailed and got him in. But I got Archie involved, and I got Rex Kern involved, and I got a number of the guys up there of that caliber. And when you get those kind of guys as speakers, people are going to come, and people came, and they gave them the message, and we had a great FCA. And I had Bob Haddon, incidentally, Allison named her baby Haddon, which is the same name that Bob Haddon, one of my best friends in the FCA in Columbus, his last name, Bob Haddon. I got Bob Haddon, I got those guys involved. I got my CPA involved, got John Leonard involved, got Kenny McClure involved. They went out to Bexley and started a group. I got the Arlington group started and so forth, and it really went. So the FCA, over time, meant a great deal to me. I spent a lot of time in the FCA. I've made probably 100 talks to high school classes or to classes relative to starting the FCA group. I got your brother Chaz involved in the FCA. But one of the things that that really is sensational, I think, it was 2001. I had open heart surgery, and I was having my annual physical, and the doctor said, "I haven't had you on a treadmill for a while." He said, "I'm going to put you on a treadmill and see how your heart's doing." So I get on this treadmill. After about 15 minutes, he stopped and said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa." I said, "What's the matter?" He said, "God, that heart of yours is about to stop." He said, "You're going to have to have open heart surgery tomorrow." And I said, wait a minute, who's going to do it?" "Well," he said, "I'll make all those arrangements." And I said, "No, you're not going to make them for tomorrow." I said, "I want to make a couple of calls here and get myself set up on these doctors and so forth." So I called Johnny, who was a very good friend of a prominent physician in Miami, and I asked him who the best heart guy was, and they told me the best heart guy and so forth. So, and I went in, and Johnny's friend checked me, and he said, "Yeah," he said, "you got to have open heart surgery. Isn't there a question about it? They're not kidding you." So we arranged to have it in 3 days or something like that, and the doctor that we got was the doctor that was recommended. The only problem was he was 39 years old. And I asked my doctor, I said, "This guy's pretty young to do it." "Yeah," but he said, "there's no question about it. In South Florida, he's the eminent open heart surgeon." But he said, "They'll have a couple of other doctors in there with him that are older." So he said, "Don't worry about it. You'll be in the best hands possible." So we're all there. Your mother's there, Cody's there, Johnny and Jimmy. And I'm being shoved into the operating room. And the doctor stops. And he said, "Would everybody please hold hands?" He said, "I'd like to make a prayer." And he made a beautiful prayer. And after he finished, I said, "I'm very impressed with that prayer." I said, "Who are you praying for, you or me?" He said, "I'm praying for both of us." I said, "Okay." So he did the operation. And then 2 days later, he comes in to see me. And I said, "My family was very impressed with your prayer, as was I." I said, "I don't know what you could have said that gave me any more satisfaction or peace with the Lord." I said, "It was just absolutely beautiful." I said, when did you come to the Lord? Actually, he said, yes, I have. He said, I was recruited by the University of Florida to play football. And he said, my first year I was running around with football players, and boy, he said, we were a wild bunch. But he said, my second year, one of my friends said he was going to an FCA meeting, and he'd like to have me come along. And he said, I went, and he said, I was absolutely amazed. There were about 250 or 300 kids there. And he said, the most wonderful bunch of kids I'd ever been with in my life. Completely different than the guys I'd been running around with. And I could see that these were the people to stay with, or I was going to be in real trouble if I continued running with that other crowd. So he said, I went into the FCA full bore. And boy, he said, I bought that hook, line, and sinker. And he said, I came to the Lord 100%. And he said, since I've been practicing, I've become deacon in my church and blah, 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 and so forth. And I said, isn't it prophetic? I said, about 50 years ago, I was with a couple of gentlemen, one called Tom Landry and one called Branch Rickey, and they convinced me that the FCA was a great organization, and I've been working for 50 years recruiting kids to the best of my ability into the FCA. And I said, here, the day before yesterday, a person who came to the Lord by virtue of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes was holding my heart in his hand, and my life was literally in his hand while he was repairing my heart and putting it back in, and was a devout member of the FCA. I said, is that full circle or what? And a little tear ran down his cheek. He said, handwork of God. He said, absolutely the handwork of God. So anyway, the Lord has meant a lot to me. I haven't given the time and the deep devotion to the religion that Cozy has as an example. Cozy is a great model, and I wish that I would have lived my religious life the way she has lived hers, because she is a believer, a deep believer, and she has convinced me, and I believe in God. I believe He's our Lord and Savior. I believe the only way you get to heaven is through God and Jesus Christ. And I believe those basic things that I have learned by being a Presbyterian, a Lutheran, a Catholic, a First Community, and so forth. I've not studied all of these religions deeply, but I've been sufficiently exposed to them that I realize that it's all with God. I mean, He knows when you're going to be born. He knows how many hair you have on your head. He knows when you're going to die. And you better devote your life to Him, and you better be a believer if you expect to go to heaven. And I'm a believer, although I'm not a practicing Christian to the extent that I would like to be, or a practicing to the extent that Cosette is. Now, since I've met Jeannie Henry is a very devout Presbyterian. And Jeannie and Cozy have convinced me that I need to be in a Bible study. And Jeannie has started a little Bible study that she and I, every Monday night, we have our little Bible study. And Cozy has given us the devotionals and so forth to use. And I'm getting back to the point where I'm starting to read the Bible and do those things. But we were in a fantastic Bible class at Coral Ridge. One of Jim Kennedy's members, who was a retired medical doctor, very smart guy, had our class, and boy, Mary Jane and I were there every Sunday at 11 o'clock, and that class of his lasted for an hour, and I learned more about God and religion and Christ from that experience than from any other experience that I've had. But I've been fortunate that I've been exposed to people whose hands are shoving me toward God to the extent that they can, and I hope to the extent that is necessary for me to get into heaven. Because Mary Jane and Jeannie and Cozy are all very devout, and they're all Presbyterians, and they're all shoving me in the right direction. But in answer to the question, has religion played a part in my life? Religion has played a very important part of my life. Not as great a portion as I wish it had of. And I had one event that I'm very ashamed of and that I wish I could have changed. Billy Graham was in Columbus on a crusade. The 6-day parade a 6-day period, and the sessions were being held in the baseball stadium, the old Columbus Redbird baseball team. The sessions were being held there, and they were packed. And the first one we attended, we were going to go all week because your mother was in the choir. The Billy Graham, they had about 400 kids in the choir, and she was in that choir. So we were taking her each day, or each evening, and we were all going, Jimmy and Johnny and Cozy and Mary Jane and your mother. And it came time, he made the call to come down in front and pledge your life to Christ. And Cozy said, or Mary Jane said, come on, we're going to go down. And Cozy jumped up and said, oh boy, Mother, I want to go down. I can't wait to get down there. And I turned to the boys, they were sitting, my two boys there, and I said, what do you guys think? And Johnny said, I don't think I'm going to go down there. And I said, how about you, Jimmy? And Jimmy said, oh, I'm not going if Johnny's not going. And instead of me doing what I should have done, as a good father, I should have grabbed them both by the neck and said, we're all going down together. The whole family's going down with your mother and with Cozy. But I sat back and didn't make the move. So Mary Jane and Cozy went down in front. And of course the girls in the choir, the young ladies in the choir came down. And so Mary Jane and her mother and Cozy all did the thing that Billy Graham requires you to do when you come to the Lord. And the three jackass sat up in the back row of the baseball stadium, too embarrassed to walk down through the crowd, too afraid to show the world that we were believers. And we didn't go. And I've always regretted that, because it meant an awful lot to Mary Jane and Cozy and your mother when they went down. But I sat in the back, and I hope I've made enough amends to overcome that. If the Lord holds that against me, I hope that He'll forgive me for not having made the move that I should have made, and which I've always regretted not having made. But there's no question in my mind but what God is our Lord and Savior, and you better line up on the right side before it's too late. And I hope that when I do go, that I have believers holding each one of my hands and trying to pray me through, or whatever it takes to. Jeannie believes very strongly in the power of prayer, and her belief has been greatly reinforced by virtue of her grandson-in-law, who had a stroke at age 32 or 33, and they had to take out his piece of his skull and so forth, and she has so many friends in this community, and I think she called them all and asked them to get him on the prayer chain, because the doctors at New York General Hospital have almost unanimously agreed that a miracle was performed with respect to him being saved. And Jeannie believes unequivocally that the prayer chains that were started for him was what pulled him through. I mean, there's no question in her mind. There's 4 times the doctors told his wife that he'd never make it, you know. So that's kind of evidence of something. So having said that, I don't know that there's any more that I can say, except my days are numbered, and I hope when the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there.